This week we're going to be looking at Romans chapter 1, verse 18 through chapter 2, verse 6. And this is really an important step forward in our journey through the book of Romans. In the first couple messages, we've seen Paul sort of laying out in broad terms the big themes of the book. But now he's going to really start to zero in and work through those ideas more carefully. And the first thing we're hit up with right off the bat is this word wrath, right? That the wrath of God is being revealed against wicked, ungodly, unrighteous people. And it's maybe worth thinking a little bit about how we feel about the idea of a God who judges, a God who punishes, a God who looks at human beings and doesn't just applaud, but instead looks at human beings and sees wickedness deserving of punishment. Because sometimes I think if we're honest, our reaction to that is to say, well, God, that's not fair. But part of what we're going to see as these next few chapters of Romans unfold is that it's completely fair. It's completely just. And what we learn from this passage is this. We as human beings can't blame God for our lack of knowledge of Him, our lack of knowledge of what to do in terms of right and wrong, any of those things. Because the reality is, God has made it abundantly clear that He exists through His creation. He's made it absolutely clear. We are the ones who are actively suppressing the truth that there is a God and that we owe Him thanksgiving and worship and obedience. Just one example. So there's all of these different physical constants that the physicists will tell you have to be fine-tuned to incredible precision in order for the world as we know it to even exist and function. So there's lots and lots of these things. You can look them up pretty easily on the web. And so it's a mystery, right? Because it seems like some intelligent being created the universe and would have had to intentionally finely tune all of those things just right so that life as we know it could even exist, matter as we know it could exist. So, if you don't believe in God and a creator, how do you explain that? Well, as I've read around, the most common explanation I run into is people who just say, well, maybe there's an infinite number of other universes we can't see, all with different physical constants, and we just hit the jackpot, and we're the ones who were lucky enough to be born in the one where all the constants are just right and actually work. To me, that requires a lot more faith than believing in a God who is a creator. And even more, I think what Paul would say is people when they say things like that, they're actually actively suppressing the clear truth that God has presented them with. Now, that doesn't mean our response should be to be angry at them. I mean, they need to have compassion for them. But that's the truth, right? That's what's happening. But then the second thing we see, and I think this is very important from this text as well for talking about in your groups. In fact, this may be one of the most important things to talk about in your groups, is once we acknowledge that there's a creator, what should our response be? Well, it's thanksgiving, it's worship. But because we reject God, what we instead do is we substitute idols. More than once in this passage, you'll see this idea of exchanging, right? We exchange the true God for some other idol that we're going to worship instead. Mark Vance, when he was teaching at Salt Company a few weeks ago, put it this way, and I really liked it. He said, look, all of us worship. We all do. So if you feel like your worship of God isn't what it should be, ask yourself, what are you worshiping instead? Because it's human nature to constantly be finding other things other than God to try to worship instead. There's idolatry that goes deep into our hearts, and it can be money, it can be sex, it can be the opinion and esteem of others, our own physical comfort. I mean, the list can go on and on of what those things are. But it is so easy for us to be consumed by them. I think a third point that we get from this passage that's important is how the rejection of God leads to messed up moral thinking, right? Some people may want to say, well, look, I can be moral without God. And at one level, that's true. I mean, in terms of just people's outward behaviors, at least, sometimes you meet people who don't believe in God at all, who seem to act a whole lot better than people who would profess that they were Christians. But there's something else this passage points us to that helps us to see deeper into what's really going on in those kinds of situations. When we reject God, our thinking starts to become confused about morality. And it's just a matter of time, I think, that we're going to have this tendency to gradually get more and more off base. Now, one of the examples that's used in Romans chapter 1, and maybe people in your group will have questions about this, has to do with sexual immorality. Sexual immorality is mentioned a few times. There's some references to homosexuality in particular. How do we make sense of this? Well, I think it makes sense if we put it in context with the larger argument. If you reject God as creator, your moral thinking is going to go off. So if we believe that there's a creator, then the fact that human beings are male and female is something God did on purpose, right? It has moral significance. If the fact that human beings are male and female is just a random accident of evolution, then there's no moral significance to it at all. So why should it enter into our thinking about sexual morality? But it's a much bigger deal than just issues about homosexuality. I mean, when I talk to students at Iowa State in my classes and different kinds of things come up, the overall just view of the world I see from students is that when it comes to sex, many of them just don't think there's anything morally significant about it. It's just one more way to amuse yourself and have fun. Well, again, if you think that the way we are, the fact that we even have sexual natures at all is also just a random accident of evolution. I mean, it could have worked out differently. We could have reproduced some other way. Then I think it's just a matter of time that our whole view of sexuality, if God is taken out and the idea that we were created for a particular purpose is taken out, all of those things are going to be way off. And we see how in this passage at the end of chapter 1, as people reject God, God in some sense says, okay, if you want to try to do this without me, I'll let you. And people just start spiraling down farther and farther into just more and more wickedness. And I think for many of us, when we look around the world, what we see is, all kinds of confirmation of the truth of what Paul's saying, just ever-increasing wickedness. And notice at the end of chapter 1 that there's, I think by implication, two kinds of people. One kind of people being described at the end of chapter 1 is people who are not only doing all of these wicked things, sinful things, but they've even so rationalized what they're doing that they want to say that what they're doing isn't really sin at all. They actually even commend people for doing these wicked things. But by contrast, there's presumably other people, many people in your connection group perhaps, who aren't there. They see the wickedness going on around them and they call it for what it is. They can see that our world is deeply, deeply sinful. So that's the second group, the people who don't applaud it, who say, no, that's wrong. But notice what we see in chapter 2. The very people who say, oh yeah, that's wrong, are actually the people who do the same thing. And this is maybe the most important thing in your connection group, is we have to see it's not just the people out there who have an idolatry problem. It's not just the people out there who struggle to honor sexuality according to what God's creation purpose was, who are greedy, who are envious, who cause strife, who cause dissension. It's not them out there. We who pass judgment, if we are honest, in subtle or not so subtle ways, we do the same things. So I think this would be a great week maybe to break your connection group into men and women or smaller groups somehow, and really see if you can get people to be honest about the sin issues they're struggling with and the way the idolatries in their own heart are manifesting themselves in sin, and to draw people toward repentance.